Bonjour tout le monde and welcome to this episode of À la Une, the series in which we use the news to learn French. So recently some of you have asked me to talk about varieties of French other than that spoken in France, and others have asked me to talk about news events happening elsewhere in the French-speaking world. So I thought in this episode I would combine the two and talk about the recent attack in Quebec City as well as the variety of French spoken there, because it is indeed very different to that spoken in France. So first of all, let's have a little bit of background. Here we have a map of Canada, and here is the province of Quebec, known in French as le Québec. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The whole province has a population of about 8.2 million people, and the official language is French. Now this is important because as a whole the country is bilingual, the two official languages being English and French. But in Quebec the only official language is French, and not only is it official, it's protected by law, particularly by la loi 101, that's the law 101, which protects the language in many ways, but specifically in marketing. So for example, you are not allowed to advertise something predominantly in English. The French must be bigger, and this is why you find that some things which aren't translated from English in France are translated from English in Quebec. A good example of this being the Happy Meal from McDonald's. So in France, a Happy Meal is called un Happy Meal, it's not translated at all. In Quebec, it is known as un joyeux festin, simply because it is illegal to have the words Happy Meal written bigger than anything in French. You probably will see the word Happy Meal written somewhere, but the French will be bigger. The French-speaking population of the whole province is roughly 78.1%, so definitely the majority of people, but there are a lot of English speakers as well, particularly in Montreal. And the Québécois people are very, very proud of being Québécois, partly because of the French language. And they've already had two independence referendums, one in 1980 and one in 1995. Both of them failed, and independence isn't really a question anymore, but they are nonetheless very proud of being Québécois, as well, of course, as being Canadian. So the capital city of the province is Quebec, or Quebec City in English. It has a population of roughly 500,000 people. It's not actually the largest city in the province, that goes to Montreal, but it's still a fairly large city nonetheless. And its French-speaking population is 95.3%, so significantly larger than the provincial average, if you like. So you will have seen that we have this distinction between le Québec and Québec in French, and this is very, very important because they mean two different things. Le Québec refers to the province as a whole, whereas Québec refers to the city of Quebec City. So if you say je suis allé au Québec, that means I went to Quebec, the province. So you could have gone to Quebec City, you could have gone to Montreal, you could have gone to Tadoussac, you could have gone to all three. Anywhere within the province will do. If, however, you say je suis allé à Québec, that means you specifically went to Quebec City. And if you struggle with these, if you forget which one's which, remember that in French, when we're talking about being in a city or going to a city, we use à. So à Paris, à Marseille, à Lyon, à Québec. So à Québec is to the city, au Québec is to the province. So now let's have a think about the theme of this video, which is the recent attack in Quebec City. And first of all, as we always do in À la Une episodes, we're going to look at the key words involved. So first of all, we have the word attack, which in this case is going to be attentat, un attentat, it is masculine. You could of course describe it as une attaque, and you will hear it described as une attaque. The problem with attaque is that it's very broad. It could be anything from punching someone in the face to blowing up a building. An attentat is much more terrorist in nature. It's not necessarily a terrorist attack. It could be an assassination. It could be a mass murder, which arguably is terrorist, but it's something larger scale nonetheless, so it's a little bit more specific. Attaque is very broad. Attentat is kind of slightly bigger, slightly more serious. Then we have neighborhood, which will come up a few times in the video that we're going to watch, and that is un quartier, quartier. Then we have to burst in, which is what the attackers did, and that in French is faire irruption, faire irruption. And after they burst in, what did they do? They opened fire, which in French is very similar to the English, is ouvrir le feu. ouvrir le feu. So the only difference being, in French you open the fire as opposed to just open fire. Next we have injured as an adjective or as a noun, as in an injured person, and that is blessé. Blessé. So you could say l'homme est blessé, the man is injured, or you could just refer to him as un blessé, okay, an injured person, an injured man. Une blessée being an injured woman. Then we have the police, which is la police, and you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's obvious, but I want to bring something up here which is very, very important, and that is that in French, la police refers to the police as a whole, but is always singular. So, for example, in English, we have a tendency to say the police are here as a plural because the police represents a group. In French, though, la police is singular. La police est là. Even if the police is made up of 1,000 people, la police is always singular. On the other hand, if you want to talk about a policeman or a policewoman, or indeed a police officer, you will use the term policier, masculine, or policière, feminine. So these can be either singular or plural. So un policier is a police officer, des policiers is some police officers, and of course that could be the same if they're feminine. Une policière is one policewoman, des policières is some police women. So that's an important distinction to make. La police always singular, policier, policière could be singular or plural. So now let's move on to the video itself, which is a short news broadcast with un fil des événements, a sequence of events, so they're going to tell us exactly what happened on that day in Quebec City in beautiful Québécois French.
Ah oui, alors c'est arrivé vers 19h45 hier. Je vais vous montrer la carte pour bien comprendre où on se situe. On est en plein cœur de Québec. On est dans le quartier Sainte Foy. Vous voyez donc les grands axes autoroutiers qui sont juste ici. L'université Laval se situe tout juste ici. Et puis le centre islamique est près donc du boulevard Sainte Foy ici. Vous le voyez, gros plan sur ce bâtiment qui est tout juste situé à côté de l'autoroute. Et puis donc c'est vers 19h45, je le disais hier, que deux hommes ont fait irruption ici dans le bâtiment, au premier étage, salle de prière des hommes. Ils ont ouvert le feu, possiblement avec des armes automatiques de haut calibre. Ils ont fait plusieurs blessés, plusieurs morts et ont par la suite quitté. Il y a une personne qui a pu prendre la fuite dans un véhicule. L'autre suspect a été arrêté dans les environs du bâtiment. On ne sait pas exactement où, mais on sait que les policiers ont pu l'appréhender dans ce secteur-là. Je le disais, donc, une autre personne a pu prendre la fuite et a pu parcourir quand même une bonne distance. On le voit bien sur la carte. Voici donc le centre islamique tout juste ici. Vous voyez l'île d'Orléans. Eh bien, c'est tout juste à côté du pont de l'île d'Orléans, ici dans la bretelle, que l'autre suspect a été appréhendé. C'est lui-même, Marc-André, qui a appelé les policiers une quinzaine de minutes après l'appel initial à la police pour l'événement survenu au centre islamique. Il disait avoir des remords, il voulait parler aux policiers le plus rapidement possible. Il s'est garé sur le côté de la route. Vous voyez son véhicule ici, c'est un modèle Mitsubishi. Alors les policiers qui l'ont appréhendé sur place, on a bouclé tout le secteur. L'autoroute a été complètement fermée, le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres armes, d'autres explosifs, et puis aussi le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres suspects aussi qui étaient en fuite. Tout porte à croire donc qu'il n'y avait que deux seuls suspects dans cette histoire. Bilan donc jusqu'à maintenant de cette attaque, 6 morts, 8 blessés et 39 personnes qui s'en sont sorties indemnes.
Okay, so of course one of the challenges with this may well be the accent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but before that let's go through it line by line and just have a look at what he says and have a look at and see what vocabulary we can take from it. So first of all, he says...
Ah oui, alors c'est arrivé vers 19h45 hier.
Oui, alors c'est arrivé vers 19h45 hier. So the oui presumably is a response to whatever the guy said to him beforehand, and the alors is like right or so. In English it just allows you to start saying whatever it is that you're going to say. So all of the important information is what follows. C'est arrivé vers 19h45 hier. So you probably recognize arriver as meaning to arrive, but in this case it actually means happened. C'est arrivé, it happened, and this is a very common way of expressing the verb to happen in English. Rather than saying se passer, you can say c'est arrivé, it happened, vers 19h45 hier. So vers in a physical sense means towards. Je vais vers la maison. I'm going towards the house. But when you're talking about time, it means at a roundabout. So vers 19h45 is at a roundabout 7:45. Hier, of course, is yesterday.
Je vais vous montrer la carte pour bien comprendre où on se situe.
He then says, je veux vous montrer la carte pour bien comprendre où on se situe. So, je veux vous montrer la carte. I want to show you the map. Pour bien comprendre, pour in this case means in order to, bien comprendre, to really understand où on se situe, where we are situated, where we are located. And he doesn't literally mean we, but he means the story that we're talking about, where this all took place.
On est en plein cœur de Québec.
On est en plein cœur de Québec. So, on est is we are. En plein is a really good expression that means right in the middle of something, both geographically and sort of more figuratively. So if you say on est en pleine ville, that means we're right in the middle of town. But you could also say something like on est en pleine guerre, we're right in the middle of a war. On est en pleine crise, we're right in the middle of a crisis. So it's a really useful expression. In this case, he says on est en plein cœur de Québec. So we're right in the middle of the heart of Quebec City. So he's really right in the city centre here. On est en plein cœur de Québec. We're right in the centre of Quebec City.
On est dans le quartier Sainte Foy, voyez, donc les grands axes autoroutiers qui sont juste ici.
So here he says, on est dans le quartier Sainte Foy, vous voyez, donc les grands axes autoroutiers qui sont juste ici. So, on est dans le quartier Sainte Foy. We are in the Sainte Foy neighborhood. We learned before, quartier is neighborhood. Vous voyez. I think here it probably does say vous voyez rather than just voyez as you've seen in the subtitles, but it's just so very short and subtle that you don't really hear it. Either way, it means you see, right? In the same way that you would say it in English, we're in the Sainte Foy quartier, you see here? Donc, you probably know as therefore or so, but you'll see he kind of peppers it throughout his speech here. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean therefore, it's just kind of a filler that helps him to kind of keep the speech going. Les grands axes autoroutiers, un grand axe autoroutier is like a large intersection on a motorway, qui sont juste ici, which are just here.
L'Université Laval se situe tout juste ici.
L'Université Laval se situe tout juste ici. So l'Université Laval is, of course, a university in Quebec City. Here we have again, se situer, to be located, to be situated. Tout juste ici. So tout juste is exactly or right here. So tout juste ici, right in this very spot.
Et puis, le centre islamique est près donc du boulevard Sainte Foy ici.
Here we have a wonderful expression of the Québécois accent. Et puis, le centre islamique est près donc du boulevard Sainte Foy ici. So, et puis, and then. And this which in standard French, if you like, I mean, it's not really standard at all, but in French would be pronounced bain, as opposed to bang. It's kind of very Marseille, that. Doesn't really have any meaning, okay? It's just another filler, a little bit like donc, but it has even less meaning than donc. Le centre islamique, the Islamic center, est près is here. Donc, again, doesn't really mean therefore, it's just a filler. Du boulevard Sainte Foy ici. So, and then we have the Islamic center, which is close to the boulevard Sainte Foy here. And of course, he points at the boulevard itself.
Vous le voyez, gros plan sur ce bâtiment qui est tout juste situé à côté de l'autoroute.
So here we have, vous le voyez, gros plan sur ce bâtiment qui est tout juste situé à côté de l'autoroute. So this sentence demonstrates really well how this video is really good for your listening skills because he repeats himself all the time, and not in a bad way, he just uses similar vocabulary, and that's good for training your ear to understand it. So vous le voyez, you see it, okay, sort of variation on what we've seen before. Gros plan, close up, sur ce bâtiment, on this building, qui est tout juste situé, which is situated right here, tout juste, we've seen that before, situé, we've seen that before, à côté de, next to, l'autoroute, the motorway. So you see it here close up on this building, which is just here, situated right next to the motorway.
Et puis donc c'est vers 19h45, je le disais hier, que deux hommes ont fait irruption ici dans le bâtiment, au premier étage, salle de prière des hommes.
So this is quite a long extract, but there's nothing really too difficult in here. We have « Et puis donc, c'est vers 19h45, je disais, hier que deux hommes ont fait irruption ici dans le bâtiment au premier étage, salle de prière des hommes ». So really, there's not a lot going on here, it's just lots of bits of information. So « Et puis donc » and so then, it really doesn't have much meaning other than, as we've seen before, just to keep the sound going so there's no awkward silence. The important information follows. C'est vers 19h45, it was at around about 7:45, je disais, I was saying. Hier, yesterday, que deux hommes, that two men, ont fait irruption, burst in, we saw that in the keywords. Ici dans le bâtiment, here in the building, au premier étage, on the first floor, salle de prière des hommes, the men's prayer room. Salle de prière is a prayer room. So like I said, this is just lots of information. Linguistically, it's quite simple. It's a list of things that happened. It's just a case of getting your ears used to hearing exactly what he said.
Ils ont ouvert le feu, possiblement avec des armes automatiques de haut calibre.
I have to admit, this sentence shocked me when I first heard it. Ils ont ouvert le feu, possiblement avec des armes automatiques de haut calibre. So, ils ont ouvert le feu, we've seen this in the keywords. They opened fire. Then we have the word possiblement, which in French isn't a word at all. It's a common error that learners of French make. They take possible, they add ment, put them together, and they think possiblement, possibly. But no, it simply doesn't exist in France. But clearly in Quebec, that is perfectly fine. Avec des armes automatiques, with automatic weapons. Notice how there I said des armes automatiques. I put a liaison between arme and automatique. In any variety of French, this is not obligatory. You can say des armes automatiques. And you generally find that in Quebec, they do less liaison than they do in France. So you're more likely to hear a Quebecois person say des armes automatiques, as he does in the video, than a French person would say des armes automatiques. I am a speaker of French, so I'm more likely to put the liaison in there. Regardless of anything, it's optional. You don't actually have to do it at all. But French people are more likely to do it than Quebecois people. De haut calibre is literally of high caliber. So des armes automatiques de haut calibre, I didn't do the liaison there, is high caliber automatic weapons.
Ils ont fait plusieurs blessés, plusieurs morts, et ont par la suite quitté.
Ils ont fait plusieurs blessés, plusieurs morts, et ont par la suite quitté. So, ils ont fait plusieurs blessés. Literally, they made several injured. Which sounds weird in English, but remember, blessé can also refer to an injured person. And faire des blessés, faire des morts is quite a common expression, particularly in journalism, to talk about how many people were injured and how many people died. They literally made several people injured and made several people dead. It's very odd in English, but you will see it an awful lot, so don't be afraid to use it. Et ont par la suite, and afterwards, par la suite, quitté, left. So they injured several people, they killed several people, and afterwards they left.
Il y a une personne qui a pu prendre la fuite dans un véhicule.
Il y a une personne qui a pu prendre la fuite dans un véhicule. So this ya is an abbreviation of il y a, there is, or in this case there was rather. And this is not just a feature of Quebecois French, this is French in general. Il y a becomes ya all the time, to the extent that people do write it, certainly not formally, but if you're writing a text, for example, or an email, you may well put ya rather than il y a. Une personne, one person, qui a pu, who was able to prendre la fuite, which means to flee, dans un véhicule, in a vehicle. So there's one person who was able to flee in a vehicle.
L'autre suspect a été arrêté dans les environs du bâtiment, on ne sait pas exactement où.
L'autre suspect, or rather l'autre suspect a été arrêté dans les environs du bâtiment, on ne sait pas exactement où. So this autre pronunciation we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So the other suspect a été arrêté, nice passive here, was arrested dans les environs du bâtiment, so les environs of the surrounding areas or the vicinity. So in the vicinity of the building, on ne sait pas exactement où, we don't know where exactly.
Mais on sait que les policiers ont pu l'appréhender dans ce secteur-là.
Mais on sait que les policiers ont pu l'appréhender dans ce secteur-là. So, mais on sait que, but we know that, les policiers, the police officers, ont pu, were able to, l'appréhender, apprehend him, dans ce secteur-là, in this sector, in that sector rather, or in that area.
Je le disais, donc une autre personne a pu prendre la fuite.
Je le disais, donc une autre personne a pu prendre la fuite. So again, we're seeing the same vocabulary over and over again. Je le disais, I was saying, as I was saying. Donc, meaningless donc once again. Une autre personne, or again, une autre personne a pu prendre la fuite. I'm so sorry to any Québécois people. I'm really not trying to be problematic. Another person was able to flee, to get away.
Et a pu parcourir quand même une bonne distance, on le voit bien sur la carte.
Et a pu parcourir quand même une bonne distance. On le voit bien sur la carte. So, et a pu, once again, was able to. Parcourir is this idea of traveling, to cross a certain distance. Quand même, this is a very difficult word to translate. I've probably mentioned it before. In this case, I would probably translate it as still. He was still able to travel une bonne distance, a good distance. On le voit bien sur la carte. We see it well on the map, literally. It's quite clear on the map. You might choose to translate it that way in English.
Voici donc le centre islamique tout juste ici. Voyez l'île d'Orléans.
Voici donc le centre islamique tout juste ici. Vous voyez l'île d'Orléans. So, voici, here is, donc, I'm not even going to mention it again, le centre islamique, the Islamic Center, tout juste ici, another word that we've seen many times, right here. Vous voyez, again, he probably says vous voyez, but it's very, very subtle. L'île d'Orléans, the l'île d'Orléans, which is an island in Quebec City.
Eh bien, c'est tout juste à côté du pont de l'île d'Orléans, ici dans la bretelle, que l'autre suspect a été appréhendé.
Eh bien, c'est tout juste à côté du pont de l'île d'Orléans, ici dans la bretelle, que l'autre suspect a été appréhendé. So again, another relatively long one with relatively little happening. So, eh bien, and so, c'est tout juste à côté du pont. It's just right here next to the pont de l'île d'Orléans, so the bridge of the île d'Orléans. Ici, here, dans la bretelle. So, une bretelle is normally like a strap, something you put over your shoulder, but in this case is a slip road que l'autre suspect, that the other suspect, a été appréhendé, was apprehended.
C'est lui-même, Marc-André, qui a appelé les policiers.
C'est lui-même, Marc-André, qui a appelé les policiers. So, c'est lui-même, it's himself or even himself, Marc-André, qui a appelé les policiers, who called the police officers. Don't be fooled by this one. Marc-André is not the name of the person who called the police officers. This is actually ambiguous. You could say c'est lui-même, Marc-André, qui a appelé les policiers. It sounds like you're saying that it was him, Marc-André, who called the police. It's not what he's doing. He's actually addressing the co-presenter at this point, and you kind of hear the other guy mumble, kind of like, He's acknowledging the fact that the guy who's talking has mentioned his name. He's talking directly to him. So Marc-André is the name of the co-presenter, not the person who called the police.
Une quinzaine de minutes après l'appel initial à la police pour l'événement survenu au centre islamique.
Une quinzaine de minutes après l'appel initial à la police pour l'événement survenu au centre islamique. So, une quinzaine de minutes is about 15 minutes. This N thing is a good thing to put after certain numbers to mean around about. So, une dizaine is about 10. Une douzaine is about 12, and that's where we get the word dozen from in English. Une quinzaine is about 15. It also means a fortnight in certain contexts. But in this case, he says une quinzaine de minutes. So that's obviously not a fortnight of minutes. This is about 15 minutes. Après l'appel initial, after the initial call, à la police, to the police, pour l'événement, for the event, survenu, which occurred au centre islamique, at the Islamic Center.
Il disait avoir des remords, il voulait parler aux policiers le plus rapidement possible.
Il disait avoir des remords, il voulait parler aux policiers le plus rapidement possible. So, il disait avoir des remords, he said that he had some remorse, that he regretted it. Il voulait parler aux policiers, he wanted to speak to the police officers le plus rapidement possible. And this is a really nice structure to learn. Le plus, blah blah blah, possible is as blah 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 as possible. So in this case, le plus rapidement possible, as quickly as possible.
Il s'est garé sur le côté de la route. Voyez son véhicule ici.
Il s'est garé sur le côté de la route. Vous le voyez, son véhicule ici. So, il s'est garé, he parked. Se garer is to park. Sur le côté de la route, on the side of the road, vous voyez son véhicule ici. You see his vehicle here.
C'est un modèle Mitsubishi. Alors, les policiers qui l'ont appréhendé sur place, on a bouclé tout le secteur.
C'est un modèle Mitsubishi. He struggles with that one, but gets there eventually. Alors, les policiers qui l'ont appréhendé sur place, on a bouclé tout le secteur. So, c'est un modèle Mitsubishi. It's a Mitsubishi model. Alors, so, les policiers, the police officers, qui l'ont appréhendé sur place, who apprehended him sur place, meaning on site, at the scene, on the spot. This is something you'll also see in restaurants. Things that say préparé sur place means made on site. Okay, it's made where you buy it. On a bouclé tout le secteur. The whole sector, the whole area was cordoned off.
L'autoroute a été complètement fermée, le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres armes, d'autres explosifs.
L'autoroute a été complètement fermée, le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres armes, d'autres explosifs. So, l'autoroute a été complètement fermée, the motorway was completely closed. Le temps de is during the time that, for the time that, they s'assuraient, ensured, qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres armes, that there were no other weapons, d'autres explosifs, other explosives.
Et puis aussi le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres suspects aussi qui étaient en fuite.
Again, some great repetition. Et puis aussi le temps de s'assurer qu'il n'y avait pas d'autres suspects aussi qui étaient en fuite. So, et puis, and then, aussi, also, le temps de s'assurer, the time that it took to ensure that there were no other suspects who were also en fuite, fleeing.
Tout porte à croire donc qu'il n'y avait que deux seuls suspects dans cette histoire.
Tout porte à croire donc qu'il n'y avait que deux seuls suspects dans cette histoire. So, tout porte à croire is everything leads us to believe. Donc, therefore, qu'il n'y avait que deux seuls suspects, that there were only, il n'y avait que, only, deux seuls suspects, two lone suspects, dans cette histoire, in this story.
Bilan donc jusqu'à maintenant de cette attaque, 6 morts, 8 blessés et 39 personnes qui s'en sont sorties indemnes.
And finally, bilan donc jusqu'à maintenant de cette attaque, 6 morts, 8 blessés et 39 personnes qui sont sorties indemnes. So, bilan is one of those words that's really hard to translate. In financial terms, I think it means like a balance sheet, but in this case is an assessment or some kind of evaluation of the outcome. So our assessment, therefore, is that jusqu'à maintenant, until now, de cette attaque, in this attack, 6 morts, 6 deaths, 8 blessés, 8 injuries, et 39 personnes qui sont sorties indemnes, and 39 people who came out of it, who got out of it, indemnes, unharmed. So that's it for the video. Hopefully the subtitles and the vocabulary have helped. I highly recommend that you go through that vocabulary and pick out the stuff that you find particularly useful. Now I want to talk about some of the sounds, because I've mocked it a little bit without meaning to offend anyone. I actually think it's a really nice accent. It's one of those accents that I think most people hate to begin with, but then when you spend some time with it, you learn to kind of love it a little bit, and I really enjoy it as much as I make fun of it. I'm not very good at imitating it, I have to say, so listen to real Quebecois speakers to get a real idea of how they speak, but I'll do my best just to discuss some of the main differences between French phonology and Quebecois French phonology. So first of all, we have these laxed vowels. What is a laxed vowel, I hear you say? Well, in the French from France, the vowels are very extreme. They're quite tight. We have I and A and U and O. Whereas in Quebecois, they're a little bit lazier than that, if you like. So rather than autoroute and automatique, we have autoroute and automatique. Okay, O and E instead of U and I. I say lazy not in a pejorative way. I don't mean that it's a bad thing that the Quebecois do, but it's just not as tight and stretched as the French vowels are. We then also have affricated dentals, more fancy terminology. So a dental sound is one that happens near the teeth, so that is the t sound in French. So in standard French, this word that you see in front of you would be pronounced situe. Okay, situe. In Quebecois French, it is affricated, meaning that there's another sound attached to it, and usually with a T, in certain environments, the sound attached to it is like an S. So essentially, T is pronounced like TS. So you'll hear in the video he says situe, situe. It's a t, 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 rather than a t, t, t. Okay, situe, situe. The same happens with a D in similar environments. And it kind of sounds like a DZ. So, for example, this is not in the video, but the word dîner in French is dîner, dîner. In Quebecois French would be dîner, 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 where the D sounds like a DZ. That is an affricated dental. It's usually the letters T and D, which in certain environments either put an S or a Z after them. Not in the spelling, just in the pronunciation. We then have weird nasals. I've not gone for a technical term on this because really the nasals in Quebecois French are just different to the ones in French, and this goes beyond the scope of this video. But you'll hear a lot of the nasals are very similar to Marseillais nasals. So instead of cinq, bien, and plein, we have something more like cinq, bien, and plein. Okay, now I'm doing that very much based on the Marseille accent because I'm more familiar with it. But it is a parallel that you can draw between the two accents. In, bien, plein. And when French people write this, they'll quite often put a G at the end, okay? Because it almost sounds like there's a G. Cinq, bien, bien, plein. Okay, it's not quite there, but that's the kind of sound you're expecting. And this is something that can really trip you up because it sounds very different to the standard French. So listen out for those. And then finally we have diphthongs, which are vowels which change within a single syllable. So in English we have these all over the place. So French has a, English has a. So it starts at an e and ends with an e. A. Okay, it's two vowels in one syllable. We have o. Okay, starts at an goes to an u. O, as opposed to o or u. And we have I, which starts at an a, ends with an e. I, as opposed to I or a in French. So usually, standard French doesn't have diphthongs. Quebecois French, though, does, presumably a result of the influence of English. So you heard me sort of mock it a little bit throughout the video. Instead of saying l'autre, he says l'autre, okay? That's highly exaggerated, but that's what he's doing. L'autre, so it's an O, as opposed to just l'autre, okay? The secret behind this is with a French vowel, you should just be able to hold it. A, O, U, oo, and it doesn't change. Whereas with a diphthong, it will. So you've got autre, okay? Again, as I said, it starts with an O, ends with an oo. That is a diphthong, and they are abundant in Quebecois French. So now let's think about some of the vocabulary, which is kind of less problematic. There are, of course, differences in vocabulary, but nothing that really impedes understanding that much. I'd say there are fewer differences between the vocabulary of French and Quebecois French than there are between British English and American English, but that's not an official thing. It was just my assumption. So the example we had in the video was possiblement, which doesn't exist in French, and generally will be expressed as peut-être in France. The word peut-être does also exist in Quebec, but they are just allowed to use possiblement if they want to. Some other words that are sort of typical of the differences are fin de semaine or fin de semaine in Quebec, which in French is weekend. Sorry, French is weekend. These are all varieties of French. Magasinage is the typical example, that is shopping in French from France, so it contains the word magasin, of course. And un char in Quebec is what in France is une voiture. It comes from the word chariot, like a chariot, would you believe? So that's all for this video. I know it wasn't a comprehensive what's the difference between Quebecois French and France French, but that's a whole other video. If you would like me to do that, I can, but just bear in mind I'm not a sort of absolute expert on all things Quebecois. I just know the few things that I know. I think this is a good idea. I like going through news from elsewhere in the French-speaking world, so we might look at some Belgium stuff, some Switzerland stuff, some stuff going on in Africa. I think that will be good. Hopefully this video has been useful to you, even if you're not that interested in the Quebecois French side of things. Hopefully the news stuff was. Like I've said a few times, I think this video is really, really good because he repeats himself a lot, saying the same things will get you used to hearing the same things. Of course, as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I've put some links in the description to some really nice videos that explain a little bit more about Quebecois vocabulary and phonology. It's made by someone who is a native Quebecoise, but who moved to France and adopted a French accent. So it's Quebecois explained by a Quebecoise in Parisian French, so that might be a little bit easier to listen to. So do enjoy those. As I said, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And until next time, à bientôt!